With that, take it away.
All righty. Thank you, Bill, and good evening, everyone. As Bill mentioned, I'm Tammy with the Wisconsin Beef Council, and pleased that you could all join us here tonight for this overview of the National Beef Quality Audit. So the Wisconsin Beef Council partners with the Division of Extension in Bill and Sandy in implementing the Beef Quality Assurance Program here within our state. So we're pleased to have the opportunity to have Michaela Clauser with the National Cattlemen's Beef Association here tonight to give that overview of the most recent results of the beef quality audit. Michaela is the Director of Producer Communications at NCBA, and with that, she leads the development and implementation of their educational programs, from their Cattlemen's College that are held at the annual convention to the Stockmanship and Stewardship Program and the Beef Quality Assurance programs there. She earned her Bachelor of Science from the University of Nebraska at Lincoln in Ag Econ and her MS from Oklahoma State University, also in Ag Econ and International Agriculture. She is a native of Nebraska and grew up on her family's registered Angus and Simmental operation. So welcome, Michaela, and we look forward to hearing your presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Tammy. And thanks everyone for having me. We really enjoy partnering with the Wisconsin Beef Council and working so closely with Sandy and Bill and Tammy from the National Beef Quality Assurance team. So they really run a really excellent program there in Wisconsin, and it's a pleasure to be here tonight and excited to share the results from the 2022 National Beef Quality Audit. First, I'm going to provide some background and kind of where the audit got started. It's a pretty expansive research project that takes place every 5 years, and it's a research project that's meant to serve you as producers, and it's funded by you as producers. It's completely funded by the beef checkoff, so putting your dollar to work there. But first, I'll provide some background of the quality audit. So some of you may remember, in the late 80s, early 90s, our consumers were not pleased with our product. We had consistency issues, we had quality issues, there were defects, injection site lesions, that our consumers were not too pleased. And so the lead economist for the then National Cattlemen's Association, which is now NCBA, wrote a white paper that calculated that we were losing about $12 billion as an industry, leaving that money on the table as for producers. And so we came together and decided we needed to decide where do we go from here? You can't manage what you don't measure. And so that's where the National Beef Quality Audit was formed. And then that is where the National Beef Quality Assurance Program came from. So the National Beef Quality Audit takes place, goes into several phases. So the first phase is the interview phase. And so that is where we interview those big buyers of beef. We specifically focus on those employees that make purchasing decisions for cattle and product for companies, packers, retailers, further processors, food service, and we'll see a breakdown of that here in a second. We interview them from anything from what does food safety mean to you to sustainability goals and kind of anything in between. It's a pretty extensive interview process that's automated, so no human bias or hopefully no human bias is involved there. And then we go on to phase 2, where we collect the in-plant data collection. So this is where we work really closely with the universities and grad students and undergrad students to go to the plants and collect this data. And we begin collecting data, from the type of trailer that these cattle arrive in to hide color, mobility scores, all the way through the processing facility. So hot carcass weight, ribeye area, any bruising or defects, we track that. And so it's a massive set of data, and we come together at the end is what is called the industry strategy session. So representatives from up and down the supply chain come together and and look at, where have we come, where are we winning as an industry, and where are some opportunities for continuous improvement. So for the 2022 audit, we went to 42 different plants across 18 different states. You can see them there on the map. The red dots indicate the cow and bull plants, and the blue dots indicate the fed cattle plants, where they overlap a little bit there, meaning that those plants harvested both cull cattle and fed cattle. We collected data from September 2021 through November 2022, and collected data from well over 30,000 head of both fed cattle and market cows and bulls. So first, we're going to start with the interview phase, specifically for the fed cattle. As you can see here, this is a breakdown of those interviews. We interviewed packers, retailers, food service, further processors, and government and trade organizations. An example of those GTOs would be like the U.S. Meat Export Federation. And these aren't these numbers don't appear to be overwhelming, but they represent anywhere from 60 to 90% of their sector of who we were able to interview. So it's really representative of the industry. So we always ask what type of cattle these companies purchase. And as you can see, there's really great representation of both dairy and beef, but just wanted to point out here that this is the first audit that we collected data from where these companies reported purchasing beef on dairy cattle. So since it's the first audit, we have no trending data, but just, an interesting call out. And as the industry continues to shift and change, the beef on dairy getting that call out with this question. So we'll start with the fed cattle here, and we'll look at a SWOT analysis of strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So first, when asked what changes has your company witnessed since the 2016 audit, as you can see, highlighted knowledge of the program, meaning that knowledge of animal welfare programs like the Beef Quality Assurance Program, it has become a lot more well-known further down the supply chain. So it's expanding beyond just the production phase and going into those packers, retailers, food service, and further processors, that they are recognizing that program. Additionally, we have become more efficient as an industry overall when comparing to the 2016 audit. We think that there's a multitude of reasons for this. We can't talk about this audit without mentioning the COVID-19 pandemic, and we'll talk about the positives and negatives here in a couple of slides. But we were able to shift and adjust as an industry, especially when comparing to other proteins. We experienced a lot of challenges and faced a lot of hardships as well, but we were able to adjust and make those changes in 6 months, when typically, it might have taken years to make those supply chain changes. So with that, they came more efficiency. What are the strengths for the fed cattle sector? Product quality. This was highlighted throughout, and we'll see that more in the implant data collection phase, but we heard that we were producing a really high quality, wholesome product that our consumers want. Opportunities, just increased education efforts, meaning both on the producer and on the consumer side. So increasing those education efforts in terms of the BQA program for the producer, but also on the consumer side of things, that's where educational efforts from Beef It's What's for Dinner come into play. So just something to highlight there. Potential threats for the industry. This is a little unique specifically for these companies, environmental threats and activists. So not necessarily a big concern for producers, but this is what these companies, what customers are looking at when looking at potential threats. So when asked, what does the term food safety mean to your company? You can see here, it means everything. We thought that was something to really hang your hat on for this audit. We heard things from representatives that food safety is assumed. It's a way of doing business. So that was a big key takeaway that we got from these results. When asked what does the term animal well-being mean to your company? These companies directly associate animal well-being with animal handling. So the way that these animals are cared for throughout their lifetime, and how they are handled both at the producer level, and then also the requirements on how they are handled there at the packing plants. BQA is able to directly come in and answer that, and we're seeing that from more than just from these large companies down the supply chain. We're seeing that directly from our consumers that purchase beef in the grocery stores at the meat case. So I wanted to pull a couple of slides from our consumer market research. When asking our consumers if they have any concerns with cattle production, as you can see, 43% have no concerns. They know that we are producing a safe, high quality product. And however, the top concern expressed was animal welfare there at 29%. So it wasn't hormones, not environmental impact or antibiotic usage. It was animal welfare. That's where BQA can directly come in. And we have seen that. So as you can see here, this is looking at perception of how cattle are raised has improved after being exposed to the BQA program. So as you can see before, to these consumers, before they were exposed to the BQA program, they were hanging out right there in that middle part. Didn't really have a strong emotion associated with how cattle were raised. But it certainly shifts to the strongly positive after they were exposed to the BQA program. So like I mentioned, the impacts from the COVID-19 pandemic during this audit, that's certainly something to call out, is that this audit was done under extraordinary circumstances during a very particular time in history. So it certainly stands apart from past audits. So positive outcomes, we know that beef performed. So we all saw photos of the meat cases where the beef case was empty and the alternative proteins was full. So we know that our consumer was looking for our product and wanted our product. Negatives, however, I'm not gonna go into the laundry list that we all know with labor struggles, supply chain malfunctions, market volatility. We certainly face a lot of hardships during that time. So now we're going to switch over and talk about the phase 1 interview phase for those market cows and bulls. So starting with the overall image of the cow and bull industry, it is very good. So when comparing back to the 2016 audit, the perception of the sector has improved. And so we thought that was great when looking at that data and looking at the takeaways from these companies. The strengths that these market cows and bulls provide a ton of secondary value. These retailers, food service, further processors, they're using a lot of primals and subprimals from these cull cattle to meet demand and create and produce high quality products. So these cull cattle are not just going into grind. We are using whole cuts from them. Weaknesses, however, and we'll talk about this later in the presentation, foreign objects. There was not necessarily an increase in foreign object, but an increase in detection. So specifically for these packers and further processors, they are taking measures into detecting foreign objects more to reduce those customer and consumer complaints. So with that, opportunity is really similar on the Fed side, continued producer education to address those issues such as foreign objects and continue to spread the BQA message. So when looking at what changes has your company witnessed since the 2016 audit, really, again, similar to the Fed side of things, overall knowledge of the program, becoming more knowledgeable of the beef quality assurance program further down the supply chain. So now we'll switch into phase 2, so the in-plant data collection for fed cattle. We'll start with BQA transportation certifications. This was the first audit where we asked transporters if they were familiar and or certified with their BQAT certification. As you can see, over 90% were both familiar and or certified. We were really excited about this. The BQAT program is relatively new. 2017, 2018 was the debut. And we know that those packers are using this industry-led educational effort to implement into their transporters, utilizing it more and more. So we were really excited about this, that the industry has taken to this. So when breaking down trailer types, as you can see for fed cattle, the vast majority, almost 98% came in cattle pots. And then just some things to point out here. I won't go over all these numbers, but just wanted to break down. So time traveled. So the average time that these cattle were on the trailer was about 3 hours, with the maximum time of 23 hours. So at least one of these loads, these fat cattle were on the trailer for 23 hours. And then area allotted. So only 6 square feet for these animals. And you know, that's not for a minimum, you know, that's not a ton of room. These are really large animals. You know, they're coming in at 1,500 pounds. And our BQA recommendation is 6 square feet per 1,000 pounds for one animal. So and these animals are even larger than that. So they were pretty tight in there, and that certainly could cause for you know, more injury and bruising, which we'll see. So cattle mobility worsened ever so slightly when comparing to the 2016 audit. A lot of those, some of those mobility score 1s moved to mobility score 2s. We don't see too much of an issue with this, as mobility score 2s are still deemed fit to transport. Knowing that since this did take place during the pandemic, with the backlog of cattle and having to hold cattle, that's where a lot of these mobility issues could come from. And candidly, we've heard from research being done recently that we have gone back to pre-COVID mobility scores. So just a call out there is to see how the pandemic affected the cattle mobility scores. Predominantly black-hided cattle, 62% of these fed cattle were black-hided, compared to 58% in the 2016 audit. And this is just a breakdown of all hide colors and breed types. Something else to mention here is in 2016, about 20% of fed cattle were Holstein, and that has dropped down to a little over 12%. We think perhaps that is the beef on dairy influence, and also knowing that these dairy cattle are bred to more than just black-hided bulls, Charolais types, red-hided bulls. So just an interesting call out there. Bruising. So this is no bruising, meaning that almost 52% of all fed cattle carcasses had at least one bruise. So bruising did increase this audit. And with that, severity also increased. As you can see, there was, when comparing 2016 to 2022, there were more major bruises and critical and extreme bruising. So switching things up a little bit, certified marketing programs. This plays right into that story of just the high quality product that you are producing. To compare, in 2016, about 6% of fed cattle qualified for certified Angus beef. And as you can see here, almost 15% qualified for CAB. So knowing that these cattle are feeding into these certified marketing programs more and more. And with that, changes in prime and choice over time an increase from 2016 to 2022 from 71% to 76% of all cattle, at least grading choice or better. And then prime, a big jump here from 2016 to 2022 at 7.5%. And we heard from some plants that they were averaging about 10% of cattle were grading prime. So we thought that was really exciting. Some of the researchers at the strategy session said that they never thought that they would see the day that plants were averaging 10% prime. So we thought that was pretty exciting. But with that, with those higher quality, with those better quality grades, comes more fat, and then these higher carcass weights. So we saw an increase in hot carcass weights that were 1,000 pounds or higher, and then also an increase in ribeye area of an average of 14 square inches for ribeye. And then also an increase in yield grade 4s and 5s. So in 2016 at about 14.5% up to almost 23% of all fed cattle carcasses were yield grades 4s and 5s. So some issues, but certainly a lot of wins that we can take away from the fed cattle side of things. So now we'll switch over to phase 2 implant data collection for market cows and bulls. So for these transporters, we focus on the just BQA program, not BQAT, knowing that a lot more producers directly haul cull cattle to plants. So we were still really excited about these numbers, with almost 70% of these transporters were familiar with the BQA program. And again, here's a similar chart, but just for the market cows and bulls. The average time travel that these cull cattle were on the trailer was a little over 6 hours. And something to point out here is that this is just their final leg of their trip. So we don't know if they came, how long they were at the auction barn. We don't know how far away, home base was to get to the auction barn and then to get to the plant. So that's certainly something to think about when thinking about fitness for transport. Can these cattle withstand the rigors of transport? They're being culled, they're being sent to town for a reason. So can they withstand the trip to the sale barn, being in that yard for a day or two, and then heading off to the packing plant? So just something to consider there. Maximum time traveled there, 24 hours. So at least one load was on that trailer for 24 hours, which is a pretty extensive time for some of these cattle. Trailer type surveyed, so a lot more frequency in gooseneck trailers, knowing that some producers were hauling their cull cattle directly to these plants, but still a vast majority were coming in cattle pots. And from that, gooseneck trailers were coming directly from the ranch or dairy, and then almost 70% of those cattle pots were coming from auction market. So they're coming from those sale barns. Mobility. This is just comparing beef cows and dairy cows. As you can see, there are a little bit more mobility issues with dairy cows there, but on the beef cow side of things, still nothing too concerning. With those mobility score 3 numbers being relatively low, and then no mobility score 4s for beef cattle. And this is just looking at beef cows classified as inadequately muscled. So meaning that these cows were a muscle score of 1 or 2. So you can see a big increase. In 2016, only about 35% of beef cows classified as inadequately muscled, and that jumped up to 70% for this audit. This audit took place during the COVID-19 pandemic, but it also took place during a really significant drought. We know that producers were liquidating, had to send cattle, didn't have the feed resources, so we saw a lot of those cows come through the plants. And a really similar story here when comparing body condition scores in beef cows, a lot more higher frequency in those lower body condition scores of 1, 2s, and 3s. When comparing 2016 to 2022, knowing that body condition scores of 2 or less, so those 1s and 2s are not deemed to fit to transport. So do they have the energy supply to withstand the haul? So we just saw a higher frequency of that. This is just a breakdown of hide color again. So as you can see, vast majority were pattern cattle. I know it's a little deceiving. They were not necessarily Holstein pattern. A lot of them were, but just pattern in general, and then at 33% black-hided cows and bulls. So this is a percentage of all cattle surveyed with arthritic joints. A big success story with the Beef Quality Assurance Program is that we have practically eliminated injection site lesions, which is great. As an industry, we're able to implement that program and correct where we were giving injections and fixing that problem. And we can say the same story with these arthritic joints, with only a little over 1% of cattle having an arthritic joint. It's an animal welfare issue, a mobility issue, but also a food safety issue and a lost opportunity for producers. When there is an arthritic joint present, if it bursts open there on the floor and contaminates the carcass, that has to be cut out. It cannot be washed off, and a lot of those packing plants completely remove the entire round and hindquarter of that carcass to eliminate that risk. So that leaves a lot of lost opportunities. So this is a really great story to tell as well. So this is a percentage of cattle with no bruises. Again, meaning that 66% of these market cow and bull carcasses had at least one bruise. So bruising did increase, and that's a pretty high frequency of these cull cattle with at least one bruise. And this is also looking at bruise severity. So when looking at 2016 to 2022, bruise severity did increase, really similar to the fed cattle side of things, increased there in that major and critical. However, when looking over time, it is still trending downward. So we know that we are making progress as an industry when comparing audit over audit. So this is percentage of defects in surveyed market cows and bulls. This is just comparing beef cows and dairy cows. Beef cows, 66% did not have a defect. And then if they did, it was only, mostly only one defect. And then looking at dairy cows, almost 64% of dairy cows had at least one defect. So food safety, like I mentioned, this is what I wanted to circle back on. So percentage of plants that reported foreign objects found in beef from market cows and bulls, as you can see here, 100% of these plants found birdshot and buckshot, and of those plants, 50% of them reported customer complaints, meaning further down the supply chain, mostly in those further processors, reported back to these plants that they found birdshot and buckshot. So it's a really big issue, and a point of discussion for this go round of the audit. We did not survey the cow and bull plants for this. They volunteered this information to us. So knowing that it's a big concern for them there. So mostly birdshot and buckshot, but also bullets, needles, wire, darts, and then other foreign objects. So just a quick overview for categories of focused improvement in fed cattle, knowing that food safety is a top priority, and with that, cattle health, foreign object call out, but then also just to continue to increase efficiency as an industry. For those market cows and bulls, focusing on that timeliness and marketing cattle at the ranch, the foreign object issue, eliminating that as a sector, increasing greater coordination between veterinarians and producers to promote the BQA principles, and then increase effective communication with transporters and producers as well, as they transport cattle. So I know that was a lot of information. I certainly wanted to acknowledge we worked with about 15 different universities for this, and then like I mentioned, numerous grad students and undergrad students to collect this data. So certainly appreciate all their help. But with that, I'm happy to take any questions if anyone has any questions. We have a pretty extensive executive summary and then 2 4-pagers, one dedicated to the Fed sector and one dedicated to the market cow and bull sector at bqa.org. So encourage everyone to go check those out. Additionally, we have some additional resources coming out focused on that cull cattle management. We have a campaign coming out called Right Way, Right Time, focusing on timeliness and marketing cattle, and addressing how you can add value to your cull cattle, to those market cows and bulls. That will be that official rollout is at our cattle convention here in Orlando in about a week and a half. So be on the lookout for that. But with that, happy to take any questions from anyone.
Yep, so we do have one in the chat and ask if you have any further details of why cattle have the bird shot, buckshot.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So that's certainly been a big point of discussion. So why do cattle have birdshot and buckshot? We know that it is not regionally, so it's across the country. We've heard that from these cow and bull plants. There can be a multitude of reasons. Some want to say hunters are an issue. I'm sure that that is an issue, but also, I think it's just a poor handling of some of these cattle. I know birdshot and buckshot can be used when with brush cattle, trying to get cattle out of the brush. Bulls that are fighting, if your neighbor's bull gets over and is breeding your cows, getting him out of there. I think there's a multitude of reasons of why producers are using it. However, a shotgun is not a proper handling tool, so we certainly we don't tolerate that. But it's but again, so there's a lot of different reasons that it's getting in there.
Okay, if you got other questions, please feel free to enter those into the chat and we can have Michaela address them. In the earlier session, we did talk a little bit about where the bruising was occurring on the animals. Maybe we want to talk a little bit more about that with this group tonight too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a good thing to mention. So where is this? So where is all this bruising taking place? For fed cattle, we're seeing it along the top line quite a bit. So we can't necessarily pinpoint exactly how or where that's happening, but we can guess that it's handling facilities, but a lot of it is in the transportation process. A lot of those cattle, it's not a secret that they're getting larger, and so to accommodate these large cattle facilities and those cattle pots have to be altered, and that's a big ask for these transporters and producers. It's not inexpensive at all. So, a lot of those cattle are hitting their top line pretty severely, going down into the belly of a cattle pot. So during that transportation phase, we're seeing quite a bit of bruising. For market cows and bulls, again, seeing it on the top line, but also seeing a lot of bruising on the ribs. So on the side, we saw quite a few carcasses that we were calling them window carcasses. The whole part of the side was cut out, like a window. You could look right through it. That can be from a multitude of different things. How they were handled at home, at the auction barn, fighting cattle, facilities, improper use of handling tools. A lot of different things can attribute to that, to those types of bruises.
Yeah, and I guess the other thing too is you showed that a lot of them were in poor body condition score than was ideal. And
yep.
So they probably don't bounce off of things very well without bruising either.
Yep, exactly. Those lighter weight cattle, lighter body condition scored seem to bruise a lot easier.
Yeah, so we've got a couple more questions here. The next one is regarding the needles that are, excuse me, the needles being found in the carcasses. Are they primarily being found in the neck, or are they showing up other places in the carcass as well?
Yeah, so we weren't able to, when communicating with these plants, that wasn't collected where the needles are found, but candidly through just conversations with them, that they when finding needles, it's kind of throughout the carcass, but also knowing that a broken needle in an animal can migrate quite a bit. So I think that's hard to say, but knowing that there were broken needles found, I heard the shoulder, the round, all of the above. But we didn't have a ton of specifics on that from this data.
All right. So then the next question, kind of along that same line, is are packing plants installing better instrumentation for detection of foreign materials?
Yeah, these packing plants are using using x-rays, using metal detectors, using magnets to detect these foreign objects and get as much as they can. However, specifically with that bird shot, those fragments can be pretty small and it can get through, and that's where then down the line at the further processor and grind they find it. But the vast majority of these plants do have at least one or most likely two forms of technology to detect foreign objects.
Okay. We've got another question here. So here in Wisconsin, the auctions have only one buyer that requires BQA certification of the cattle producer for fat cattle. And as you well know, there are several other ones that also require it. They're just not necessarily buyers in Wisconsin. And so the question is, do we see this as a continuous thing in the industry?
Yeah, absolutely. We do. We work really closely with the auction market sector, knowing that it is such an important part of our industry, and working closely with those folks to promote BQA and hopefully require BQA. We have no authority over that. That would be, organizations such as LMA or anything. So we do partner with them and know that a lot of those barns and associations, they do a lot of work and focus on training and everything. But it certainly is a struggle in the industry. Yes, we are certainly aware of that.
Right, but there is more than one packer that requires BQA to sell to them.
But yes, three of the big four do.
Yep. They're going about it. Some of them don't buy out of Wisconsin. And some of them, I think the way they're set up is if you deliver potloads to the packing plant, you have to have it, but they may not necessarily be requiring it from cattle bought through auction markets.
Yep.
That's the way I understand it. It's not unique to just one.
Yep. You're correct, Bill.
Any other questions from our participants this evening? We have a very quiet group. Well, this will be last call for questions, I guess. And I would like to thank Michaela for joining us here this evening and also earlier today to share this information, and also thank Tammy to collaborate with us as partners in the BQA program and beef education for Wisconsin to host these. But Tammy, have you got any comments or you would like to make yet here this evening?
Well, just wanted to extend an invite to all of our producers and those others that are on here tonight as well, that the Division of Extension, Department of Agriculture, and Wisconsin Beef Council are hosting a series of 4 beef quality workshops starting February 9th and running into the middle of March. So I'm just going to drop a link in the chat here quick, that if you're interested in more details, you can go there for that, as well as an opportunity to register. So covering a lot of the areas that Michaela touched on tonight, and how we can focus in on reducing bruising, hearing from cattle buyers in terms of the type of cattle that they're looking for, and why some cattle might receive premiums over others when they're being run through the ring. So certainly invite everybody to participate in that. But otherwise, thank you, Bill, and thanks to Michaela for joining us.
Thank you, everyone. And thanks for having me, Bill, Sandy, and Tammy. I'm always happy to talk with the Wisconsin producers. So my email is there. So please, anyone, don't hesitate to reach out to me anytime for anything BQA, and then also a quality audit as well. And again, you have a really excellent BQA program and educators there in Wisconsin. So thank you all for having me tonight.
Thank you, and everybody have a good evening.